Bible verses. You are. There will be a test. You do not know at what time the tests are coming. Yeah, it's the apocalypse. Kelly, how are you?
Chapters from Revelation.
Chapters from Daniel.
Oh, from heaven.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I have.
My hope is, since we got through all of the background issues last time, that this time I'm going to try to get through the whole book
Wow.
in one night. And then we'll have 2 weeks for Revelation.
Oh,
And of course, those aren't the only, as we discussed last time, those aren't the only apocalyptic books. But I figure between Daniel and Revelation, those are going to hit some of the major themes of the apocalyptic genre. And then you can explore the other apocalypses in your spare time. Yeah.
Is Zechariah one of the apocalyptic books?
I'm trying to think. I think it is more prophetic than apocalyptic, which is kind of a fine line.
That's what
Yeah. Hmm. The prophets, more often, I mean, some, the prophets aren't always cheery fellows.
No.
Yeah. Sometimes they can predict what seems like doom and gloom. But usually, um, if they're receiving some kind of oracle, some kind of word, God or the voice of God is coming directly to them, they're not having some sort of vision of of another worldly experience, you know. But Daniel, Revelation, First and Second Esdras, Bellman, the dragon, those are ones that have that apocalyptic feature of sort of this otherworldly experience. This is rude. I apologize. But, and the apocalyptic books kind of sort of break down into one of two ways of presenting that information. So, in Daniel, and you can see this if you look at the first chapter here on your sheet. The first chapter, those first few verses. In the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah. Y'all remember King Jehoiakim?
Yeah.
You know what? That warms my heart. That we have gotten to a point in our relationship where I can say that. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into its power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. So, two very important things just in those first two verses. Number one, this is an apocalypse that is set in history. Very specific point in time, and has to do, and we'll see more of this as we go through. This has to do this is a historical apocalypse. This is a working out of God's providence in human history. And the second verse, and we'll talk more about this in a second, but the second verse in there is also significant because it says, the Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into Nebuchadnezzar's power. So it's all about the power and the authority of God in this circumstance. What God does and does not allow that to happen. What we'll see as we go through here, and this is true of many of the historical apocalypses, is that they include a prediction of what's going to come, but it's actually people writing in the period in which those events have already happened, if that makes sense. So this is set, Daniel is set in the time of the Babylonian captivity, right? So 588, 586 to 536. This is the time period in which Daniel is set. Daniel is actually written in like 175 to 164. So it's going back and predicting from the perspective of the Babylonian captivity these things that are going to happen in the future. But actually, it's somebody who's writing in this time period, so they actually know what's happening. Does that make sense?
I'm curious, what language was it originally written?
So
I don't think it was Greek, was it?
no, it was not, and it's actually an issue in Daniel because it's written about half in Hebrew and about half in Aramaic. And whether that means there are two different authors that got stitched together later, or what that's about is a whole topic of discussion. So, I think we're good.
Let me not digress.
Yeah. So, the central figure in the book of Daniel, that name is drawn out of the book of Ezekiel, but there's no reason to think that Daniel, the Daniel who's the narrator in here, is actually a historical figure. That's a name somebody adopted as they were writing the book. But it means God is my judge, which again is significant for apocalyptic literature because there's this promise that God will bring justice, that God will decide between who is righteous and who is not, and that there will be punishment. So it's good for David if God is his judge. But probably not historical. But this issue of divine supremacy, we see that as we go on through here. In these passages, the king commanded his palace master to bring some Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility from Jerusalem to Babylon. And it says they brought the most handsome ones, pure and unblemished, which could mean all sorts of things, but it could mean that they were members of the priestly community, because you couldn't have a physical defect to be a priest in Israel. So, commanded that they bring them here and assign them a daily portion of food and wine, and they would be educated so that they could be servants in the court. So they are on His Majesty's Secret Service. Thank you. And among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. Now, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah Daniel's given another name too that we don't recognize. But these other guys, we recognize more often by their Babylonian names, which are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So Daniel says, I'm not going to defile myself with food that the king is going to give me, because there are, of course, strict food regulations for the people of Israel. So he says, I'm not going there. The person who's responsible for his care is concerned because he says, if you look weak, then it's going to be my fault. I'm going to be held responsible. The king is going to think that I'm embezzling your supplies for me. Because obviously anyone who's a vegetarian, they're just going to wither away. What are you saying, Bill? Yeah, the same thing my doctor's going to say on Friday. So they do this little test. He says, give us 10 days on our own diet, and we'll see. And after those 10 days, they look better than the people who were fed on the king's rations. And that's all attributed to God's providence. So it's, they flourish because God is greater than Nebuchadnezzar. And this concept that, the God of Israel is more powerful than any earthly authority is an important thing to get set. So we get into chapter 2 when we start to get into some of the special talents of Daniel and what he's able to do or what God allows him to do. The Chaldeans, by the way, those are the court wise men, magicians, soothsayers. Yeah. And so the king has a dream, and he says to his wise men, you must interpret my dream for me. And they're like, okay, fine. Tell us the dream, and we'll interpret it. And he says, no. You have to tell me the dream and then interpret it. And so we get to verse 11. The thing that the king is asking is too difficult, and no one can reveal it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with mortals. So even the court magicians, the Chaldeans, these are not Hebrews. They recognize that there's not a human power capable of doing what the king is asking. So the interesting thing, though, is that Daniel is able to see. The king has said he's going to wipe out all of the lies. And Daniel says, wait, give me a second. Give me the chance to answer what you want me to do before you wipe out everybody. So that Daniel and his companions with the rest of the wise men of Babylon might not perish. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. And Daniel gives thanks to God because he's gotten this vision. So it's not that Daniel, under his own power, is able to do it, but that God reveals it to him. So again, this external power intervening on his behalf. And so he says to Nebuchadnezzar, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has disclosed to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen at the end of days. And in this sense, end of days just means a long, long time from now. So it's at this point that, and this will become more and more apparent as we go along. The book of Daniel is starting to turn into either an episode or maybe the original movie of MASH. Because remember, MASH was set in the Korean, but it came out in 1972. So everybody knew this is a comment on the Vietnam, but they didn't talk directly about it. So they had to talk about Korea. So Daniel's about to become Hawkeye Pierce or something. And talk about the situation that the audience of the book of Daniel are actually in. But you start to get this this trope, this literary device of four kingdoms. Steve, will you read that paragraph for us, beginning at verse 31?
You are looking at the king, and lo, there was a great statue. The statue was huge, its brilliance extraordinary. It was standing before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of that statue was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze. It's like, its legs,
You spoke a little too soon. Yeah.
Its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron, partly of clay. As you looked on, the stone was cut out, not by human hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floor. And the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole world.
Are there any classics? Thank you. Are there any classic people who study classics in high school or college? Because there's this thing in Greek history, or the ancient Greek idea of history, that there was a golden age, and then there was a silver age, and then there was a bronze age, and that the age that they were living in was the iron age. You know, there's same elements in Roman thought and philosophy. There's a similar sort of thing in Persian thought and philosophy. The whole Zarathustrian religion has a narrative about that. It's this idea of four kingdoms and the decreasing quality, so to speak, of each of those kingdoms.
Are you saying that it goes from the luster of gold to that of iron? In reverse order that you would think.
Right. So we think of history, this is a great point. We think of history as progressing. Correct. In the ancient world, history, what's the obvious? I mean, the reverse of progress. Regress. History regress or deteriorated over time. So that there was a mythical golden age and things just got worse. Now, this is Daniel predicting into the future. So he's saying to Nebuchadnezzar, your empire, the Persian Empire, it's golden. right. It will be golden as long as you're around. But in the future, and of course the author knows this, in the future it will fall to the empire of the Medes, the Median Empire, Medes, which will then fall to the Persian Empire, which will then fall to the Greek Empire. Talk about Alexander. So the feet of clay, the legs of iron and the feet of clay, that's Alexander the Great and his successors, especially Antiochus, mixed together. So it's just getting hard. And this rock that's going to destroy them, that's Mount, that's Zion. The mountain at the center of Jerusalem, Holy Mountain, is what's destroying these kingdoms and this legacy. And that pattern of the four kingdoms is very important because it shows up over and over again throughout apocalyptic literature. And again, was a cultural theme beyond biblical literature, even. Okay. And in the book of Daniel, then we go on to get several stories. We get Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace. We get, I don't know if we can do Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel in the lion's den. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. My family would say, "What you do with the money? The money we give you for singing myself." So, we go through some of those stories. Chapter 7 is actually, I think, if I'm right, or it may be back in chapter 3, but I think it's 7, where we switch from Hebrew to Aramaic. We start to get these visions. And so, in chapter 7, Belshazzar is the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel has a dream. And in his dream, he saw the four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea, four winds, four great beasts came out of the sea, one after another, one different from another. These are the four beasts here, and it goes on to describe each of the beasts and what they look like and so forth. And we'll get to, this is, I believe, so the four beasts come out, they are out on the world, and then, as I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and his wheels were burning fire. So this looks like a person seated on a throne, but it may be another person. We'll see. There's the wheel. These we not included in your verses, but mentioned already, are the watchers. So the angels watch all around.
The term son of man used for that figure, even though probably couldn't be for it, but
We're almost there. Yeah, no, but that's a good question because all with each other and start to get mixed with each other. You know, and who's doing what and what's their relationship goes back to that sense of mystery about what this revelation is. And you have the ancient one seated on the throne. The ancient one also could be translated, or maybe more accurately translated, as the Ancient of Days. In other words, the Eternal One. Yeah. And that's the title. Yeah, you see how that capitalizes the title for this figure. And this beast right here has had it had 10 horns, 10 T-E-N, not T-I-N. So I don't always make the distinction in my vowel. Sometimes I have a ink pen and sometimes I have a stick pen. But he had 10 horns, and then three fall out and one rises up in their place that's even more arrogant. This isn't in your passages, but that is clearly representative of Antiochus Epiphanes, the one who is in 174 persecuting the Jews. And I watched them because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. So this is the speaking horn. And as I watched, the beast was put to death and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. So the Ancient of Days has got this. Whatever Epiphanes is blown off, the Ancient of Days is taking care of it. And then we get to this. Mother Nanny, if you'll read 13 and 14.
As I watched in the night vision, I saw one like a human being coming with the sun. And he came to the ancient one and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed.
So, who is this one like a human being? Okay, so that is often the way Christians have looked at the book of Daniel, is to say that one like a human being can also be translated as the human one or the Son of Man. The kind of status of this character is unclear because remember last time we were talking about characters who could, like, a king can be a person and a king can be an office. Henry VIII referred to the King of France. So this king or this figure could also represent the kingdom of Judah, the people of Israel, being given authority by the Ancient of Days. We're going to see later that the Archangel Michael shows up. So, is this the first appearance of Archangel Michael? But it's important because we hear the term Son of Man and think of it as a title. Jesus refers to himself as Son of Man or the human one, depending on the translation that you get. But in the book of Daniel, this is a descriptor. This is not, the Ancient of Days is a title. The human one is not a title. It's just descriptive of who the person is. But it's a significant figure in the book of Daniel. And does become very important to Christian understanding. So, let's see. Am I ready to go to chapter 11? Not quite. Because just following, you'll notice, by the way, that this is the way that this is laid out. Because it's in translation, we don't get quite the sense of it being in verse. But this is poetry. This is written in verse. And when we come back to the prose, which I left a one, but verse 16 here, Daniel has to go to one of the attendants, one of the watchers, one of the divine interpreters. And this is another aspect of apocalypse, is that the person witnessing them cannot understand on their own. They need some sort of interpretation. So he approaches one of these attendants to ask him the truth about the matter. And the interpreter says, "As for these 4 great beasts, 4 kings shall rise out of the earth, but the holy ones of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever." So that's where we get into, so the holy ones of the Most High, are those the Israelites? Are those the people of Judah? And so this figure of a human one being a king, that's where all of that comes from. Again, so here's one of the things, having decided to teach, this class, and having read the commentaries and so forth, I thought, before I talk about the book of Daniel, it'd probably be a good idea if I read the book of Daniel. And as I read through it, one of the things that struck me is it's incredibly repetitive. Over and over and over again, the author's continuing to try to make this point that God is more powerful than any human power, and that the people of Judah, the Jewish people, will be redeemed. And I think it's a function of the time that they were living in, that the author felt like, I need to keep coming back to this point and keep reassuring them and keep making sure that they understand what I'm talking about. So again, before the chapter ends, you have this poetry about the 4 beasts being trampled down, and the 4th beast being the worst, the 4th beast being the worst, and it's going to devour and trample the whole earth, but then there will be judgment. Then the court will sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, and he'll be consumed and totally destroyed, and the people, their kingdom will have dominion. So he keeps coming back over and over again. But again, the figure of the human divine is hugely significant going forward. So finally, chapter 11, chapter 12. These are, and again, I think 11 and 12, and maybe 10, 11, and 12, you go back to Hebrew from Aramaic. And the 11 and 12 can kind of be a snooze fest, even for somebody who loves history, because they keep going over the same. And again, it's a narrative of history. The whole point is to say God is the God of history. And the stream of history is shaped by providence. And it goes through the four kingdoms again, and talks about Alexander the Great, and then says, in his place, in the place of Alexander the Great, shall arise a contemptible person, on whom royal majesty had not been conferred. There are no names being used, by the way. I mean, the author of Daniel is smart enough to, yeah, exactly. Not name, we're not going to name names, because that'll get you killed. But we know who it is, because royal majesty had not been confirmed. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom through intrigue. And so, Epiphanes had, so his elder brother had inherited the throne. And I believe Epiphanes conspired to get rid of both his elder brother and his two nephews, who were then in the line of succession. So, and then you really get to the heart of the matter. Forces sent by him shall occupy and profane the temple and fortress. So again, this is the period of the Maccabees. And the slaughter of pigs in the temple, and so forth. And so Daniel's predicting this. The wise among the people shall give understanding to many. For some days, however, they shall fall by sword and flame and suffer captivity and plunder. Let's see. He shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the holy mountain. Yet he shall come to an end. So again, there's that reassurance that these, like this isn't going to go on forever. There will be a point at which this comes to an end. And that point will come to an end with the intervention of Michael the Archangel. If you look at the first verse of chapter 12, there shall be a time of anguish, but at that time your people shall be delivered by the intervention of Michael. Everyone who is found written in the book. Now that's referring back to chapter 7, where the Ancient One is sitting in the court and he's got the books of judgment, the books of justice open, so the just people will be found in the book. I don't know if I gave you all that verse. But here's where it gets super interesting. Because this is the first time that this ever shows up in the Bible. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. All those wise people who fell by the sword and the flame. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. It's the first time resurrection is mentioned in the Bible. And the purpose of resurrection is so that the righteous can be justified. These holy ones, the people of Judah who have suffered under persecution, even if they didn't get justice in their lifetime, they will get justice. And the unjust can receive punishment, even if they didn't receive punishment in their lifetime. So the whole point is that there is a scheme under which justice will happen, even if it's not happening in this moment. And even though people are experiencing persecution now, they will get justice in the future. And so, yeah, the interpreter says to Daniel at the end, it's okay. You go and rest. And when you rise at the end of days, you will get your reward. And for people living under oppression, for people living under persecution, this is extraordinarily important. The hope that at some point they will be redeemed is extraordinary, because otherwise, why bother? Why bother persisting in the faith that's getting you persecuted? If there's not going to be justice at some and Daniel, the author of the book Daniel, doesn't say, just give me 20 minutes and we'll get there. He does kind of lay out a timeline around which all of this is going to happen, and it's connected to the year of Jubilee. There's a passage that I didn't include that talks about talks about 7 weeks of years. A week of years is 7 years. So if you have 7 weeks of years, that's 49 years. That gets you to the 50th year, which is supposed to be the Jubilee. All debts are forgiven, and all of the slaves are freed, and everybody returns to their homeland. So he kind of puts that out there, but also recognizes, like, he's no longer doing post facto. So Daniel gets less and less specific and less accurate when the author goes past the time that he's trying to. But he does say that you will get justice one day. And so it is worth persisting under the current persecution. So.
What is I don't really get the reference of this photograph.
This is John Travolta in the movie Michael, where he was the archangel. You can barely see his wings. There were better pictures of his wings, but they were on. My computer said you don't want to download. I said, okay. I'm not going to ask you more questions. This is a work computer. So that's yeah.
mean, this is a long time ago, before Christianity. I thought Jews didn't believe in resurrection.
So that becomes a big issue. It shows up once or twice in the Gospels. There's a group called the Sadducees. There's the Sadducees and the Pharisees. I believe it's the Pharisees who believe in the resurrection. Because they're coming out this line of thought that Daniel kind of is building. But the Sadducees are connected to an older, like, priest caste. And so they're kind of pre-Daniel, and they don't want anything to do with resurrection. Yeah. So it was, I mean, this is 164, you know. So it's a relatively new concept in Judaism at the time.
I've always been curious about righteous wars. And, you know, are those two words compatible or incompatible? And then furthermore, you know, you have the holy wars, and according to our last statement here, if I'm on the righteous side, I should be able, I'm good.
Right.
Even if I die for my cause. Right?
Or
What if I'm on the wrong side and I didn't know it?
Or even if you are killed under persecution, right? If you didn't fight back under persecution and die, but are righteous, you will still get justice. So that, again, that's another point of contention between these communities around Daniel and the communities around the Maccabees. The two are not, you know, there's some overlap, but the Maccabees are the ones who thought, we need to fight the Greeks. We need to fight the oppressors. The ones around Daniel said, this is, you know, it's really God's business to work out justice. We don't need to. So, yeah, there was a tension there in that. And then I think we're still listening here. Yeah. Other questions? All right. So next week, the next couple of weeks, I think we'll dive into Revelation. So, thank you for being here. Yeah.
Thanks for telling me about it.
Yeah, it's not exactly.
That's neat stuff. Yeah. Right back there, exactly. Oh, yeah.
Did you see a web?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, too.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Although he actually knows something more about Roman occupation of Britain than anybody else. They were there for 500 years.